My name is Jack Rivers, and I always thought I had control over my life. Work was great, business was booming, I was a partner in one of the fastest growing tech companies in the city, and I had a beautiful wife, Claire. We'd been together for 10 years, and everyone who looked at us would say, "You guys have it all." But what I saw that rainy evening turned my life upside down, and now I'm not sure if I'll ever be the same man I was before. I was supposed to be in San Francisco for a meeting. Everything was arranged, the contracts were nearly signed, but due to some mix-up with the flights, I flew back home a day early. It was Friday evening, and all I wanted was to relax with a glass of whiskey and forget about work for at least one night. In my head, I was already planning dinner with Claire, maybe even suggesting we spend the weekend together. But nothing went as I had imagined. As I pulled up to the house, I saw Claire's car in the driveway. It was odd for her to be home this early. Usually, she stayed late at the office, especially on Fridays when they were finishing the latest issue of her fashion magazine. But what was even stranger was the silver sports car parked at the curb, a car I didn't recognize. I felt a slight knot in my stomach, as if I knew deep down what was waiting for me inside. I entered the house quietly, not even sure why. The silence hit me first, but as I made my way up the stairs, I heard them. The sounds. Those damn sounds that I will probably never be able to get out of my head. They were coming from our bedroom. I didn't want to believe it, but I kept walking up, my fists clenched. And when I walked into the room, my worst fears were confirmed. Claire, my Claire, was in bed with another man. He was older, in good shape for his age. Every muscle on his body seemed designed to remind me that I wasn't getting any younger. He was her lover, damn him, and I stood there, frozen, while they didn't even notice me. Time seemed to slow down. I felt a cold sweat run down my back, and my fists clenched even tighter. When Claire finally saw me, she gasped, her eyes wide with horror, not shame, but fear of being caught. "Jack," she started, but I wasn't listening anymore. My heart was racing, but inside, I felt completely numb. I walked through the room, grabbed a suitcase, and began stuffing it with clothes. The lover, who I later learned was named Mark, didn't even stop immediately, and that just fueled the fire inside me. I gave him a cold stare that could freeze the damn ocean. "Really, Claire?" My words were steady, almost emotionless. "You could have at least picked a better spot than our bed." Without another word, I walked out, got in my car, and headed straight to the nearest bar. The bar was nearly empty when I walked in. Dim lights, a few lonely patrons, all lost in their own drinks and thoughts. I sat down in the far corner, ordered myself a double whiskey, and made the decision to drink myself into oblivion. As past as I sat there, replaying what had happened over and over in my head. But instead of rage, all I felt was an odd sense of emptiness. I sipped on my whiskey, trying to numb that strange void growing inside me. Around 9 o'clock, the bar door creaked open, and a police officer stepped inside. He casually scanned the room, clearly looking for someone. I paid no attention, after all, it wasn't uncommon to see cops around here. But when he headed straight for me, I realized something wasn't right. "Are you Jack Rivers?" he asked, stopping in front of my table. "Yeah, that's me," I replied, squinting up at him. My words were starting to slur from the alcohol. "I'm sorry to inform you," he hesitated for a moment, as if unsure how to break the news, "but your wife, Claire, and a Mr. Mark Stanton were killed 3 hours ago in a plane crash. The flight they were on crashed near the coastline. There were no survivors." The world seemed to freeze for a second. My first feeling wasn't grief, wasn't shock, and I'll be honest here, it was relief. I raised my arms in an almost victorious gesture and shouted, "Drinks on me! There is a God!" The bartender and a few patrons lifted their glasses in my direction, and the officer just stood there, stunned. He clearly wasn't expecting this reaction from a man who had just learned his wife was dead. "Mr. Rivers," the officer started again, cautiously, "I understand this must be a shock, and..." "Shock?" I laughed, my voice thick with whiskey. It's more like pure joy, officer. I walked in on them today, you know, in my own bed. I was going to leave her. Hell, I couldn't have asked for a better outcome. The officer was clearly taken aback. He glanced over at the bartender, who gave a knowing nod. We typically ask the next of kin to identify the bodies, but I'm guessing you're not up for that tonight, the officer said, more to himself than to me. I nodded, understanding that tomorrow, once the alcohol and the immediate betrayal faded a bit, I would have to face reality in the morgue. But not tonight. The next morning was brutal. I woke up in the backseat of my car, stiff and aching, my head pounding from all the whiskey I drowned myself in. The sun was blinding, and for a few seconds, I wasn't sure where I was or why I felt so hollow. But then it all came back, the betrayal, the plane crash, and the relief. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined the entire thing, but the ache in my chest told me otherwise. I needed to face the wreckage, not just of the plane but of my life. I stumbled into the bar, grabbed my keys from Zane, the bartender, and thanked him for not letting me drive home last night. He nodded silently, as if he knew there was more to say but decided to let me be. I drove back to the house, still trying to wrap my head around everything. When I stepped through the front door, the smell of the place hit me like a wave. It still smelled like her, that perfume she loved, the lingering scent of vanilla and something floral. My stomach turned as memories of the previous day came rushing back. The bedroom door was still ajar, and though I couldn't see it from where I stood, I could imagine the scene. I didn't want to go in there. Instead, I sat down on the couch, closed my eyes, and tried to breathe. But the peace didn't last long. I knew I had to go to the morgue. I arrived at the morgue with a pounding heart, more from anxiety than from the hangover. The medical examiner greeted me with a somber nod and led me to a cold, sterile room. The air felt thick with finality. My eyes were burning from lack of sleep, and I hadn't eaten anything since the night before, but I wasn't hungry. I was numb. "Mr. Rivers, are you ready?" the examiner asked. Ready? Was anyone ever ready to do this? I gave a weak nod, and they pulled back the sheet. Claire's face was a mess, crushed and distorted from the crash. A part of me wished I hadn't agreed to this. It wasn't the face of the woman I had married, the one I had loved for years. All I could see now was the woman who had betrayed me. It felt as though she had died twice, once when I walked in on her with Mark, and now, lying here, cold and lifeless. After I confirmed it was her, they asked if I wanted to see Mark as well. I hesitated but agreed. His body was equally mangled, though some small part of me felt a twisted satisfaction knowing he hadn't escaped unscathed. I looked down at his battered face, wondering if he had any regrets in those last moments. Did he think of his wife, his family, or was it all just a game to him? Leaving the morgue felt like I'd just walked out of a nightmare that was never supposed to happen to me. But it did. Claire was gone. Mark was gone. And suddenly, I was free in a way I never expected. The word freedom tasted strange, bitter even. It wasn't the kind of freedom I wanted, not the kind you seek. It was the kind that leaves scars. My mind was in a fog as I drove back home, replaying the events over and over. Back at the house, I couldn't shake the overwhelming sensation of emptiness. There was a strange quiet. Too quiet. Even the hum of the refrigerator or the occasional creak of the floorboards felt wrong, as if the house itself knew that everything had changed. I couldn't stay there any longer, not with the memories of what had happened just a day ago. So I made a decision. I packed up everything I thought I might need into a couple of suitcases, grabbed the essentials, my laptop, some clothes, a few personal items, and left the rest. I couldn't stand to be surrounded by the ghost of my old life. I threw everything into the back of my car, and just like that, I was gone. The first stop I made was the bank. I transferred half of our joint account into my own name, not caring if it seemed petty. I knew I didn't owe anyone an explanation. As I sat there, the bank teller politely asked me if I needed anything else. I looked at her, her pleasant smile completely detached from the storm inside me. "No," I said quietly. "This will be enough." I found myself checking into a dingy motel on the outskirts of town. The neon sign flickered, the kind of place you pass by and barely notice. It wasn't glamorous, but it didn't need to be. I wasn't looking for comfort. All I wanted was to be alone, far away from anything that reminded me of Claire or Mark. I laid down on the stiff mattress, staring at the ceiling, the weight of everything crashing down all at once. Grief is strange. It doesn't hit you all at once, it creeps up slowly, like a shadow following you around until you finally notice it. One minute you're fine, and the next, it's like you've been punched in the gut. Claire's betrayal still stung, but the fact that she was gone, that we would never have that confrontation, that closure, weighed heavier than I thought it would. But it wasn't sadness that gripped me. No, it was a mix of anger, disbelief, and relief all swirling together like a toxic cocktail I had no choice but to drink. I thought about all the years we had spent together, the good memories tarnished now. I thought about how she must have been planning this, the affair, the vacation, while I was none the wiser. I was a fool, but not anymore. Days passed in a blur. I kept to myself, barely speaking to anyone. The silence was suffocating at times, but I wasn't ready to confront the world. I stayed in that dingy motel, avoiding calls, ignoring emails. The outside world felt distant, irrelevant. I was numb, not just from Claire's betrayal but from the reality of being suddenly, shockingly alone. And then, out of nowhere, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but something compelled me to answer. "Mr. Rivers," a woman's voice came through, calm but firm. "Yeah, who's this?" "This is Tessa Stanton," she paused, as if letting the name sink in. "Mark Stanton's widow." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Of all the people I expected to hear from, the last was the wife of the man who had just helped destroy my marriage. I wanted to hang up, to not deal with it, but something kept me on the line. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice harsher than I intended. "I want to talk." "In person," she said. "I think you and I have a few things to discuss." Her voice wasn't accusatory or emotional. It was steady, calculated, like she had already processed the shock and was ready to move on to the next step. And maybe, just maybe, I could use that same clarity. "Fine," I said after a long pause. "Where?" "We met at a coffee shop far enough away from town that neither of us would be recognized." I saw her the moment I walked in, tall, poised, with a sense of elegance about her that was impossible to ignore. She didn't look like a grieving widow, at least not in the traditional sense. There was something cold in her eyes, like she had come to terms with the truth a long time ago. "Mr. Rivers," she said as I sat down across from her, a slight nod of acknowledgement. "Tessa," I replied, not really knowing what to say. For a moment, we sat in silence, the weight of everything hanging between us like a heavy fog. She was the first to break the tension. "I know about Claire and Mark," she began, her voice steady, as if she were discussing something mundane. "I knew before the accident." I blinked, surprised. "You knew?" She nodded. "I had my suspicions for months. He became distant, his work trips more frequent. But I wasn't blind. I had someone follow him. When I found out about your wife, I didn't know what to do. I thought maybe I could confront him, but then the crash happened." I leaned back in my chair, processing what she just said. So she had known about the affair, had planned to confront him, but never got the chance. In some twisted way, we were in the same boat. "Why didn't you say anything?" I asked, not out of accusation but genuine curiosity. She gave a bitter smile. What would it have changed? The marriage was already over in my mind. Confronting him wouldn't have saved it. It wouldn't have fixed anything. I nodded, understanding more than I wanted to. Claire had already been lost to me long before I caught her in our bed. And now, both our spouses were gone, leaving us with nothing but questions and the mess they'd made of our lives. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel alone. Sitting across from Tessa, it dawned on me that maybe the only person who could understand the twisted mess of emotions I was going through was her. She had lived the same betrayal, experienced the same loss, not just of a spouse, but of the life she thought she had. We were strangers, yet there was an unspoken bond between us, forged in the fire of shared pain. "What now?" I asked, not sure what answer I was expecting. Tessa stirred her coffee slowly, her gaze fixed on the swirling liquid. "I'm not sure," she admitted, her voice softer than before. "I've spent the last few days trying to figure out what my life looks like without Mark in it. I'm guessing you're doing the same with Claire." I nodded, though it felt strange to even think of Claire in the past tense. Everything had happened so fast, from the moment I caught her cheating to the news of the crash. It was as if my life had been flipped upside down in the blink of an eye, and I was still scrambling to make sense of it. "We don't owe them anything, you know," Tessa continued, her tone suddenly firmer. "Not an ounce of grief. Not after what they did." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I wasn't sure how to respond. She was right, of course. I didn't owe Claire anything. But the pain was still there, the betrayal still fresh. And yet, Tessa's resolve, her ability to push forward, even with the weight of everything on her shoulders, stirred something inside me. "What if we're the ones left with all the mess?" I asked, voicing the thought that had been gnawing at me. "They are gone. We're the ones picking up the pieces." Tessa looked at me, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she was measuring my words. Then she leaned forward, her expression hardening. "Then maybe it's time we start cleaning up. On our terms." The conversation with Tessa was like a wake-up call. In the days that followed, we kept in touch. At first, it was just short texts or quick calls to check in, but soon we were meeting regularly, always somewhere quiet and out of sight. We weren't friends in the usual sense, but we were connected by something deeper, the need to rebuild after our lives had been shattered. Tessa was a force of nature. I didn't realize it at first, but she wasn't the type to sit and wallow in misery. She had a plan, or at least the beginning of one, and I soon found myself pulled into it. "I've been thinking," she said one afternoon as we sat in the corner of a small cafe. "Neither of us can just go back to what we had. It's gone. But that doesn't mean we have to let it define us." I raised an eyebrow, curious. "And what are you suggesting?" She smiled, but there was a sharpness to it. "We do something with this. With what we've been through." I wasn't sure where she was going, but I could see the determination in her eyes. "Like what? Write a book? Start a support group for the betrayed?" Tessa laughed, the sound dry and humorless. "No, nothing that cliché. I was thinking of something a little more tangible. Real change." She paused, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of vulnerability in her. "Mark and I, we had investments. Businesses. He had plans for expansion, but he's not here to see them through." I leaned in, intrigued. "And you want to carry them out?" She nodded slowly. "I want to do more than that. I want to turn this mess into something meaningful, something that proves we can rise above what they did to us." Tessa's words hung in the air, heavy with possibility. I hadn't expected her to propose something so bold, but in a way, it made perfect sense. We had both been brought low by the same people, betrayed in the most personal way. Now, standing at the edge of this new reality, the idea of taking control, of turning this disaster into something powerful, sparked something inside me. It wasn't just about healing anymore. It was about reclaiming everything they had taken from us. "What exactly are you thinking?" I asked, leaning in, intrigued by the fire in her eyes. She paused, studying me for a moment before answering. Mark had investments in several up-and-coming tech startups. He wasn't just playing the stock market, he was actively involved in shaping these companies. I know enough about them to take over his role, but I need someone who can navigate the business world. Someone who can see the big picture. Her gaze locked onto mine, and I felt the weight of her words. She wasn't just looking for a partner, she was looking for someone who could help her execute a vision. And strangely enough, I felt a pull toward this. A chance to rebuild, not just for myself, but for both of us. I've spent my life building companies, I said, my voice firm. If you're serious about this, I'll help you. But it's not going to be easy. These startups aren't guaranteed success. I know, she replied. But if we do this right, we won't just be keeping Mark's legacy alive. We'll be creating something bigger than they ever could. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, late-night strategy sessions, and endless paperwork. Tessa was relentless, throwing herself into every detail of the businesses Mark had left behind. I found myself both impressed and exhausted by her determination. She wasn't just trying to pick up the pieces of her shattered life, she was determined to build something new, something unshakable. One of the companies we focused on was a software firm that had been on the brink of releasing a new app that promised to revolutionize digital security. Mark had been instrumental in getting the project off the ground, but with his death, the company had stalled, its leadership unsure of how to move forward. Tessa and I stepped in, meeting with the board, reviewing the product's potential, and crafting a strategy to push the release. It wasn't long before I realized just how good we were together as a team. The long hours and late-night discussions blurred the lines between work and our personal lives. The chemistry between us became impossible to ignore. We didn't talk about it directly, but the tension was there, simmering beneath the surface. Every glance, every brush of the hand felt charged with something more. One night, after a particularly exhausting meeting with investors, Tessa and I found ourselves alone in her office, the city lights flickering through the windows. We had been working late, poring over financial reports and preparing for the next big pitch. I could feel the weight of the past few weeks pressing down on me, and I knew she felt it too. But despite the fatigue, there was a shared sense of accomplishment. "We're really doing this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would shatter the fragile progress we had made. "Yeah," I agreed, leaning back in my chair, letting out a long breath. "We are." She stood up and walked over to the window, staring out at the city below. "It's strange, you know," she said softly. "For so long, I was consumed by anger, by the betrayal. I didn't think I'd ever feel this, alive again." I watched her, the silhouette of her figure framed against the city lights, and something inside me stirred. It wasn't just admiration for her strength, though that was undeniable. It was something deeper, more primal. I stood up and joined her by the window, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her body. "Tessa," I began, my voice low and uncertain. She turned to face me, her eyes searching mine. And before I could finish my thought, she leaned in, her lips brushing mine in a kiss that was soft at first, tentative. But then it deepened, and all the tension that had been building between us for weeks finally broke. We clung to each other, the weight of everything, the pain, the loss, the rebuilding, dissolving in that moment. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathless. Tessa looked up at me, her hand still resting on my chest. "This doesn't have to change anything," she whispered. "But maybe it could." I didn't know what the future held for us, but I knew one thing for certain: in that moment, I wasn't alone anymore. That night changed everything. After that kiss in Tessa's office, the boundaries between us blurred in ways I hadn't anticipated. We didn't speak of it the next morning, as though some silent agreement had been made to let things develop naturally. But there was no denying it anymore. Something had shifted, something that went beyond business or shared pain. We had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. The following weeks felt different. the tension between us had transformed into something electric. Every glance, every moment we spent together was charged. It was as if the weight of everything we had been through pushed us closer, pulled us into each other's orbit with an intensity neither of us could resist. Late nights became the norm. We'd spend hours working, strategizing, piecing together the future of the businesses we were taking over. But the work was just an excuse. After the meetings, after the emails and phone calls, it was just us. And those stolen moments became the only things that mattered. One evening, after a particularly grueling investor presentation, we found ourselves back at my place. It wasn't planned. I didn't even think twice about inviting her over. It just felt right. My apartment was a far cry from the sleek, modern space Tessa had, the place I had retreated to after walking away from the home I once shared with Claire. It was modest, barely decorated, more a place to sleep than to live. But that night, with Tessa there, it felt different. We opened a bottle of wine, sat on the floor in the living room, surrounded by files and notes, half-heartedly talking about work. The conversation shifted, though, as it always did. Soon, we weren't talking about the future of the company. We were talking about ourselves, about where we had come from and what we had lost. We shared stories about our pasts, the parts of ourselves we had buried deep after the betrayals we endured. And then, in the middle of it all, Tessa leaned in, her face inches from mine, and whispered, "I don't want to be alone tonight." I didn't either. The next morning, I woke up with her beside me. The first rays of sunlight were creeping through the blinds, casting a soft glow across her sleeping face. For the first time in months, maybe years, I didn't feel that familiar knot of dread in my chest when I woke up. Instead, there was a sense of peace, fragile, but real. I lay there for a while, just watching her sleep, feeling the rise and fall of her breathing next to me. This was different. This wasn't just some fleeting affair to fill the emptiness left by Claire's betrayal. With Tessa, it felt meaningful. As though all the pain, all the chaos had led to this, to us. When she finally stirred and opened her eyes, there was a brief moment of uncertainty between us. Neither of us spoke right away. The night before had been a release, but now, in the quiet light of morning, there were questions. What now? Where did we go from here? Tessa sat up, pulling the sheets around her, and gave me a small, tired smile. I guess we need to talk about this, she said, her voice hoarse from sleep. Yeah, I agreed, but I didn't want to. Talking would make it real. It would force us to confront what had happened, what was happening between us. But before we could get into it, my phone buzzed on the nightstand, cutting through the quiet. I glanced at it, ready to ignore it, but something about the message caught my eye. It was from one of our business contacts, someone who had been on the fence about partnering with us. Urgent. We need to meet ASAP. There's been a development. The message on my phone kept flashing in my mind as Tessa and I dressed in silence. It was a strange moment, the mix of intimacy from the night before and the sudden pull back to reality, to business. I could feel the tension between us as we got ready, but neither of us wanted to ruin what had just happened by diving into heavy conversations. Not yet. We grabbed coffee on the way to the meeting, barely exchanging words as we sat in the car. My thoughts kept drifting, wondering what urgent development our contact had referred to. After weeks of grinding and pushing through countless obstacles, we were so close to getting the last pieces of our plan in place. But something in the tone of that message unsettled me. When we arrived at the sleek, glass-walled office downtown, Tessa was already in work mode. Her face was all business, her eyes sharp and focused. Whatever personal moment we had shared the night before was tucked away for now. And, honestly, I appreciated that. We had more at stake than just our feelings. Inside, we were greeted by Alex, one of the venture capitalists we had been trying to win over for weeks. He looked tense. His usual easygoing demeanor had been replaced by a serious expression. The air felt heavy, and I could tell something was off. "Thanks for coming in so quickly," Alex said, shaking our hands. We've hit a snag. Tessa and I exchanged a quick glance, but neither of us spoke. We let him continue. There's been some interest from another group. They're offering more aggressive terms, and the board is leaning toward them. I wanted to give you both a heads up before it becomes official. I felt the blood drain from my face. We had poured everything into this deal. Everything. And now it was slipping away right when we were so close. Tessa, however, didn't flinch. She leaned forward, her gaze steady. What kind of terms are they offering? She asked, her voice calm, collected. Alex hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. They're offering a much larger upfront investment, with quicker returns for the board. It's hard to compete with that. Tessa nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing in thought. I could almost see the gears turning in her head. She was calculating, figuring out our next move. What if we could match their offer? She said suddenly, catching both me and Alex off guard. Match? Alex raised an eyebrow. Do you even have that kind of capital available? Tessa turned to me, her eyes asking the same question. We both knew the answer. No, we didn't have that kind of money ready to throw in. But something in the way Tessa looked at me told me she had a plan. Something I wasn't seeing yet. I nodded, trusting her instincts, though my stomach churned with uncertainty. We'll figure it out, I said, the words feeling heavier than I expected. Alex gave us a tight smile. All right. You've got 48 hours. If you can match their terms, the board will reconsider. The moment we left the office, I turned to Tessa. What the hell was that? We don't have the money to match their offer. Tessa didn't slow down. She kept walking, her pace brisk as we made our way to the car. We don't have the money yet. But we will. I stared at her, waiting for an explanation. She finally stopped, turning to face me, her expression fierce. Remember those properties Mark invested in? The real estate projects? They're sitting on a ton of untapped equity. If we leverage them, we can raise the capital we need. It's a risk, but it's the only way we're going to stay in this game. I felt a wave of relief and anxiety all at once. Leveraging the properties meant we'd be putting everything on the line. But if we didn't, we were finished. Everything we'd worked for would be gone. You sure about this? I asked, searching her face for any hesitation. Absolutely, she said, her voice unwavering. This is our shot, Jack. We take it, or we walk away with nothing. We spent the next 48 hours in a whirlwind of meetings, paperwork, and negotiations. Tessa's plan to leverage Mark's real estate assets was brilliant, but it wasn't without risk. If the deal didn't go through, we could lose everything, not just the business, but the financial security we'd both been clinging to. The weight of it all pressed down on me, but Tessa, she never wavered. She had a fire in her that was impossible to ignore. Every time I felt doubt creeping in, I'd look at her, and it would disappear. She believed in this, in us, and that was enough to keep me going. Finally, the day came. We walked into the boardroom, armed with our offer. Alex was there, along with the rest of the board. The tension in the room was palpable. Everyone was waiting for us to present our case, waiting to see if we could match the offer that had threatened to derail everything. Tessa led the presentation, as poised and confident as ever. She laid out our plan, the numbers, the vision we had for the company. I watched as the board members listened intently, their expressions shifting from skepticism to interest. By the time she was done, I could see that we had them. When Alex finally spoke, it was with a smile. You did it. The board has agreed to move forward with your offer. I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. We had done it. Against all odds, we had pulled it off. As soon as we left the office, I turned to Tessa, my frustration spilling over. What the hell was that? We don't have the kind of money to match their offer, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Tessa didn't slow down, her heels clicking against the sidewalk as she walked toward the car. We don't have it yet, but we will, she said, her tone steady, as if she had already made up her mind. I could feel the tension coiling in my chest. We had been through too much, worked too hard to let it all fall apart now. But leveraging properties and taking on this level of risk, it could ruin us if things didn't go as planned. Tessa, I called out, grabbing her arm gently to stop her. She turned to face me, and for the first time in a while, I saw the flicker of vulnerability behind her steely demeanor. Are you sure about this? If this goes south, we'll lose everything. She paused, her eyes locking with mine, and for a moment, I could see the weight of the world on her shoulders. I'm sure, Jack. We've come too far to back down now. I believe in this. I believe in us. Her words hit me hard. It wasn't just about the business anymore. It wasn't about proving anything to the people who had betrayed us. This was about us, about building something together, from the ashes of everything that had fallen apart. I nodded slowly, feeling the resolve settle in. All right, I said, my voice calmer now. Let's do it. The next 48 hours was some of the most intense we had ever faced. Tessa moved like a whirlwind, making calls, setting up meetings, working out the details to leverage Mark's real estate assets. Meanwhile, I focused on securing additional financing from a few high-profile investors I had worked with in the past. It felt like we were standing on a cliff's edge, ready to leap into the unknown. The day of the final presentation arrived, and the weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. We stood outside the boardroom, both of us dressed sharply, our game faces on. But as we exchanged a quick glance, there was something unspoken between us. A sense of calm, as if we knew, no matter what happened, we were in this together. Inside, the board members were waiting, their faces a mix of curiosity and doubt. Alex sat at the far end of the table, his expression unreadable. Tessa and I took our seats, and the presentation began. Tessa, as always, was in control, her voice clear and confident as she laid out the revised terms. She walked the board through the financials, the projected returns, and how we intended to make their investment pay off. I could see the shift happening as she spoke. The board members, once skeptical, were starting to lean in, nodding in approval. When she finished, there was a moment of silence. The tension was unbearable. Then Alex cleared his throat and looked around at the other board members before speaking. We've reviewed your proposal, he began, his voice measured. And while the other group offered very competitive terms, we believe in your vision. I felt a surge of adrenaline course through me as Alex smiled. The board has decided to move forward with your offer. Relief washed over me, the weight of the past few days lifting from my shoulders. I glanced at Tessa, who gave me a small, triumphant smile. We had done it. We had fought for this, and we had won. Later that night, back at my apartment, we celebrated with a bottle of wine. It wasn't fancy, but it felt right. We sat on the floor, just like that night weeks ago, only this time, the conversation wasn't filled with uncertainty. This time, we were celebrating something real. I can't believe we pulled it off, I said, taking a sip of wine. There were moments I wasn't sure we'd make it. Tessa smiled, her eyes softening as she looked at me. I knew we would. It wasn't about the money. It was about us, and what we were building. I nodded, feeling a warmth settle in my chest that had nothing to do with the wine. She was right. This wasn't just about business anymore. It was about us, about finding something worth fighting for, something worth rebuilding after everything we had been through. The silence between us was comfortable now, no longer filled with tension or doubt. I reached out, taking her hand in mine, and she leaned her head on my shoulder. We're going to be okay, I whispered, more to myself than to her. We already are, she replied softly. And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. Later that night, back at my apartment, we celebrated with a bottle of wine. It wasn't anything fancy, but it felt right. We sat on the floor, just like we had weeks ago, only this time, the conversation was lighter, filled with a sense of victory. We didn't talk about uncertainty or the future, we simply enjoyed the moment. "I still can't believe we pulled it off," I said, taking a sip from my glass. "There were moments when I thought it would all fall apart." Tessa smiled, her eyes glowing softly. "I knew we'd make it," she said, her voice calm but sure. "We had to. We didn't come this far just to lose." I looked at her, realizing how much her belief had carried me through the toughest parts of this journey. She had been the anchor when everything seemed to spin out of control. And now, here we were, sitting together after a hard-fought victory, a sense of peace settling in. "So, what now?" I asked, the question hanging between us, not just about the business, but about us. She tilted her head slightly, as if considering her answer. "We keep going," she said simply. "We build something. Not just with the business, but with us." The warmth in her words struck something deep inside me. This was no longer just about revenge or reclaiming what had been lost. It was about moving forward, creating something real. Together. The days that followed our victory were different. There was a new rhythm in my life now, one that felt less frantic and more purposeful. Tessa and I threw ourselves into the business, but the energy was different. It wasn't just about proving ourselves or fixing what had been broken. It was about creating something new, something we could be proud of, together. We finalized the deal with the board, secured the investments, and the company was officially ours to steer. The momentum we had built over the past months was paying off, and I could see it in the way people around us responded. There was respect, admiration, and even a little envy. We had done what no one thought we could, not just survive, but thrive. But beyond the business, something else had shifted. Tessa and I no longer danced around what was happening between us. We weren't just business partners anymore, and we both knew it. Our relationship had deepened, and with every passing day, it felt more natural, more real. One evening, after a long day at the office, we found ourselves back at her place. We sat on the balcony, watching the city lights flicker below. The cool evening breeze brushed against our skin, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to truly exhale. "I never thought I'd be here," I admitted quietly, looking out at the skyline. Tessa turned to me, her eyes soft and full of understanding. "Neither did I," she said. "But maybe that's the point. We weren't supposed to plan for this. It just happened." I nodded, feeling the truth of her words. Life had a funny way of turning everything upside down when you least expected it. But sometimes, the chaos brought you exactly where you were meant to be. In the months that followed, things continued to change. The business flourished, and Tessa and I became a stronger team, both professionally and personally. We learned how to balance our work and our relationship, finding moments of peace and happiness even amid the pressures of the corporate world. But the most important change was internal. I no longer woke up feeling the weight of betrayal or the ache of loss. The memories of Claire and what she had done still lingered, but they no longer defined me. I had moved past the anger, past the need for revenge. I had found something better, someone who believed in me, who had fought alongside me to build a future worth having. One evening, as we closed the office after another successful deal, Tessa turned to me with a smile that I had come to cherish. "We did it," she said simply, the pride in her voice unmistakable. I smiled back, feeling the warmth of her words settle in my chest. "Yeah, we did." And for the first time in a long time, I realized that I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living.